New York City received 96,000 mental health emergency calls between 2022 and 2024. The program specifically designed to handle those calls, the one that was supposed to send trained mental health workers. Instead of police conducted proper assessments on less than 1% of them, less than 1%, and the new mayor just announced he's building a $1.1 billion version of the same program. There's more. Felony assaults in NYC just hit their highest level since 1997, 6 straight years of increases. The total volume of crime is up 25% from pre-pandemic levels. These aren't small numbers. These are a city that hasn't recovered from COVID and now has a 3-4-year-old socialist mayor whose answer to that is an agency that launched last month with 2 staff members, too. This is the story of the most ambitious policing experiment in American history. And the data already tells us something very uncomfortable about how it ends. I know what you're thinking. Why does a New York crime story matter to someone in Australia? Because this debate is already happening here. Right now, in Melbourne, in Sydney, in Canberra, the exact same argument Mamdani is making in New York. Redirect money from police to mental health workers. Treat crime as a public health problem. Stop sending cops to situations that need counselors. That argument is live in Australian politics. Victoria's been cutting police overtime while expanding mental health services. Every state government is asking the same question. NYC just tried to answer. The difference is NYC is the biggest test case on earth. 8.5 million people, the most scrutinized city in the world, and the outcome of this experiment will be cited by politicians in every English-speaking country within 2 years. Your Superfund also has U.S. real estate exposure. NYC's safety perception directly drives commercial property values in Manhattan. When businesses start making decisions about whether to stay or leave based on public safety, that shows up in your retirement balance. It's not abstract, it's real. So yes, this matters enormously. Let's start with Zohran Mamdani. And I want to be fair to him, because this story is more complicated than either side wants to admit. Mamdani is 34 years old, democratic socialist, born in Uganda, grew up in Queens. He won the NYC mayoral election in November 2025 by a landslide, running on a platform of affordability, rent freezes, free buses, cheaper groceries, and a complete rethink of how the city handles public safety. He's articulate, he's passionate, and his diagnosis of the problem isn't actually wrong. His core argument is this: the NYPD handles 200,000 mental health calls a year. That's 200,000 times someone rang 000, or 911, I should say, and a cop showed up to a situation that probably needed a counselor. He says that's not what police should be doing. And on that specific point, he's got a case. So he campaigned on a solution: a Department of Community Safety, new agency, $1.1 billion budget, civilian workers dispatched instead of police for non-criminal emergencies, mental health crises, social services, outreach, all of it centralized, properly funded, properly staffed. New Yorkers elected him by a lot. But here's where it gets really interesting. Before Mamdani even took office, there was already a program doing exactly what he described. It's called BHERD, Behavioral Health Emergency Assistance Response Division. Launched in 2021, sends EMTs and social workers to mental health 911 calls instead of police. Pilot program. Promising concept. The NYC comptroller released a full audit of BHERD in May 2025, the year before Mamdani took office. And the findings were extraordinary. Between 2022 and 2024, the program received 96,000 mental health calls in its coverage areas. Over 60% were deemed ineligible too dangerous, or couldn't be properly triaged. Fair enough. That left 37,000 calls that Be Heard was supposed to handle. Eligible calls, their jurisdiction, 35% of those eligible calls received no Be Heard response. No reason recorded. The city doesn't even track why the teams didn't show up. They just didn't. Then there are the 14,200 eligible calls that came in overnight, between 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. Be Heard doesn't operate overnight, so those went to police anyway. And here's the number that stopped me cold when I read it. Be Heard conducted proper mental health assessments on less than 1% of all mental health calls in its coverage area during FY 2024. 1%, not 1 in 3, not 1 in 10, less than 1 in 100. That's not a struggling program. That's a program that is barely functioning. Now here's the thing, Mamdani knew, or should have known, because this audit was public, because the data was there, and his response was, we need a bigger version of this, with $1 billion behind it. On March 19, 2026, he signed the executive order creating the Office of Community Safety. Big announcement. City Hall cameras, supporters the works. The launch budget, $260 million. Not $1.1 billion, less than a quarter of what he promised. Staff on day one, 2 people, 2 staff members, 1 executive order, and a very, very long road to anywhere near what was promised. But here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the crime data Mamdani inherited is nothing like the simple NYC is a war zone narrative you'd expect. Murders in Q1 2026 hit an all-time recorded low, 54 in 3 months. The previous record was 60, set in 2018. Shootings are also at historic lows. And the NYPD, under Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch, a woman Mamdani kept in her job despite being an outspoken NYPD critic, credits precision policing and data-driven enforcement for those numbers. But felony assaults? 6 straight years of increases at the highest level since 1997, up 40% compared to pre-pandemic. And 39% of those assaults are domestic violence behind closed doors, invisible to street-level policing, and arguably beyond the reach of mental health workers too. That's the actual public safety crisis in NYC. Not murders, not shootings. The slow, grinding, invisible surge in violence between people who know each other and nobody, not the NYPD, not Mamdani, has a clean answer for that. So how did people respond to all of this? Mamdani at the launch was unambiguous. His exact words, officers have to handle 200,000 mental health calls a year. That is not a system that is working. Today marks the end of it. Bold, declarative, the kind of line that sounds great in a press conference and will be used against him in approximately 18 months when someone asks how the 2-person agency is tracking. But here's a quote from the same event that I think tells you more than anything else. NYC public advocate Jumatane Williams, a supporter of Mamdani's plan, standing right next to him at City Hall, told the crowd, there will be some mistakes. Full stop. That was it. That's your supporter's opening line on launch day. Not this will work. Not we're confident. Just there will be some mistakes. That happens in the police department too. That's not an endorsement. That's a preemptive apology wearing a press conference badge. Then there's Commissioner Tisch, the woman who runs the police department. The woman Mamdani specifically kept in the job when he took over. She testified at a city council hearing the day before the executive order was signed. Her estimate of how many 911 calls would actually shift away from the NYPD under this new plan, 2%. Not 20, not 52% of calls. She also said, directly, you need to send the police when there's a call for a violent person. Which sounds obvious until you realize that who decides whether a person is violent is a dispatcher making a split second, Judgment over the phone? That's the gray zone, where everything gets complicated. And the head of the new agency herself, Renita Francois, the deputy mayor for community safety, was asked about the gap between the $1.1 billion promise and the $260 million reality. Her answer? Our goal is to be a full-on department. And it will be a full-on department. This is just a first step, which may well be true, but this is just a first step is also what every government program says in year one. Right before the funding gets cut, the political winds shift and the next administration walks in and dismantles it. The political reality is stark. Mamdani created this through an executive order, not legislation. Without the city council passing actual law, the next mayor can abolish the entire thing in their first week. There's no permanence, no legal foundation, just a mayor's signature on a piece of paper. Here's what I think is actually happening. And I want to be precise about this, because both the left and right media are getting it wrong in different directions. The left is reporting this as a brave, visionary reform that the police establishment is trying to undermine. The right is reporting it as socialist lunacy that will get people killed. Both of those framings are too simple, and both miss the more interesting truth underneath. The real story is about the gap between political promises and operational reality, and specifically about what happens when you try to scale a program that has documented structural problems by simply pouring more money into it. Be Heard isn't failing because it's underfunded. It's failing because of staffing shortages. There aren't enough social workers and experienced EMTs willing to do this work. It's failing because of dispatch complexity. The 911 system isn't built to route calls this way cleanly. It's failing because the oversight is inadequate. The city doesn't even track why teams don't show up to eligible calls. These are structural problems. A bigger budget doesn't automatically fix structural problems. And here's the irony that nobody is saying loudly enough. The crime data that Mamdani is taking credit for, the historic low murders, the record low shootings, that was delivered by precision policing. More cops deployed more strategically, using data to target the highest risk areas. That was Tish's strategy. It worked. The numbers are real. Mamdani is now building a non-police safety agency on the back of crime data that improved because of police. That tension is not minor. It's the whole story. Here's my prediction. The OCS will spend its first 2 years in genuine organizational chaos. Building a bureaucracy from 2 staff members is not a small task. It's an enormous one. They'll hire. They'll restructure existing programs under the new banner. There'll be some genuine wins on the mental health response side, but the Be Heard expansion will hit the same staffing walls, the same dispatch problems, the same performance measurement failures that the audit documented. Felony assaults. The actual crime problem won't be moved by this agency because 39% of them are domestic violence, and no government program has cracked that problem cleanly. And then there's the political clock. Mamdani is term limited. The next mayor comes in, looks at a $1.1 billion agency without a legislative mandate, and makes a choice. Depending on who wins, the whole thing either doubles in size or gets absorbed back into existing departments and quietly disappears. That's not cynicism. That's just how government programs work when they don't have legislative permanence. Let me bring this home, because this isn't just a New York story for us to observe from a distance. Victoria has PISA, the Police and Clinical Early Response Program. Mental health clinicians paired with police responding to crisis calls together. NSW has similar co-responder models. WA has been trialing non-police mental health responses in parts of Perth. These programs exist because the same debate happening in New York is happening here, and the same problems are showing up. Not enough trained mental health workers willing to respond to volatile situations, dispatch systems not built for nuanced routing, accountability gaps, performance data that is hard to collect and harder to interpret The difference between Australia and New York isn't the philosophy, it's the scale. When something goes wrong in a Melbourne Pacer response, it's a state government issue. When something goes wrong in an NYC mental health response, 8.5 million people hear about it instantly. What New York is doing is essentially running a stress test that we all get to watch, and the BHERD data, which is the most comprehensive real-world data set we have on this exact question, should be compulsory reading for every state government in Australia that's having this conversation. Less than 1% of mental health calls resulting in proper assessments, 35% of eligible calls going unanswered with no reason recorded. A program that doesn't operate overnight. That's the baseline. That's where Australia's programs need to be tested against, honestly, before we scale them up and call it a revolution. For those of you with super, and that means most of you watching this, the NYC trajectory affects your investments indirectly, but really, Australian super funds hold US REIT exposure, including Manhattan commercial real estate. When major employers start looking at NYC's direction and choosing Miami or Dallas instead, as Citadel already has, that affects office vacancy rates, which affects property values, which affects your fund. It's a long chain, but it's a real one. And for those of you who travel to New York, and a lot of Australians do, the felony assault number matters, up a 40% from 2019. Worst level since 1997. That's the kind of statistic that changes how you think about walking around at night or taking the subway late. Zogan Mamdani is not wrong about the diagnosis. Police shouldn't be handling 200,000 mental health calls a year. That's genuinely too much to ask of a police department. And there's real evidence that trained mental health workers can handle a meaningful portion of those calls more effectively and more humanely. But there's an enormous distance between a correct diagnosis and a workable treatment, and the BHERD data, which was sitting there in the public record before Mamdani was even elected, tells a story that his campaign chose not to sit with long enough. Less than 1% of mental health calls getting proper assessments isn't a funding problem. It's a structural problem. And you don't fix structural problems by announcing a $1.1 billion agency on paper, launching it with 2 staff members, and calling it a historic moment. The real test of this isn't the press conference. It's what the numbers look like in 2028 when someone audits the OCS the same way Lander audited BHERD in 2025. My bet, the numbers will be better than BHERD, but not as good as the promise. And the gap between those two things will tell you everything you need to know about the distance between what governments say they'll do about public safety and what they actually manage. That gap exists in New York, it exists in Melbourne, it exists in Canberra, and it'll keep existing until someone builds a program that works before they announce it instead of after. If this gave you something to think about, the algorithm only surfaces this kind of analysis to people who subscribed. So hit subscribe and I'll keep doing the research so you don't have to. And if you want to see what happened when Minneapolis actually cut its police budget after 2020, the real before and after data on that one is genuinely jaw-dropping, and it's linked in the description. See you in the next one.